Hello and welcome back to Cruel Crimes. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for the messages of support and recognition of our efforts. It truly means a lot to us. If you're new here, please like and subscribe as it will help the channel grow, enabling us to keep providing more content. Also, please bear with us as we are a new channel and we try to improve our content with each video. So let's get into it. This is the case of the Jones family. Summerfield is a town in Florida. The year 2019, we come across the Jones family, which includes the father Michael, the children, Cameron, Preston, Merkley, and Ayanna, as well as their mother Casey, all of whom were between the ages of 1 and 10. This 6-person family came from a variety of backgrounds. Cameron and Preston, the older children, were born from one of Casey's previous relationships, with Merkley and Ayanna being Michael's only children with Casey. Michael had other children from a previous relationship. However, they do not apply to this story. Michael was born on May 1, 1981, in Vermont, and grew up there. Sadly, he was a victim of his father's abuse and had an impoverished childhood. Teachers, unaware of this situation, described the young boy as lost and confused. In retrospect, it's easy to see why he appeared that way. His father would eventually be imprisoned. And his mother began a new relationship with a different man, who, sadly, also abused Michael. In his late adolescence, he joined the U.S. Navy as a medic, where he met his first wife. Michael was now a family man, thanks to Sarah. When the couple's 3 children were born, after a few years of service, his wife assisted him in obtaining employment at a local veterinary clinic. Michael had a great time working there. While working there, he met Casey, a young woman who also worked there. Casey had a very different childhood than Michael. Her mother, Nikki, and father, David, gave birth to her on December 23, 1986. Growing up in the Indiana town of Goshen, she went to Mary Beck Elementary School and then Alcott Memorial High School. In 2009, she relocated to Florida. She began as a dog groomer and eventually became a vet technician. Friends described Casey as an amazing, kind and caring woman, with a sweet smile and a beautiful laugh who wouldn't hesitate to give you the shirt off her back. It was during her time working at the same vet clinic as Michael, that, no surprise, they first crossed paths, and this chance meeting would drastically alter both of their lives. A colleague kinship grew into a friendship from here. Soon after, the two began to have romantic feelings for each other. And so they began an affair, this leading to both of them leaving their former partners for each other. They started their own family not long after. Although Michael would become the stepfather to both Cameron and Preston, his former children would stay with his ex-wife, Sarah. But in December 2016, and again in August 2018, Michael and Casey welcomed their own children, Merkley and Ayanna, into the world. Michael and Casey's family moved into a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom trailer found on Southeast 86th Terrace in Summerfield, Florida. And although the family of 6 didn't have much room to physically expand into, the rent was low, and they enjoyed each other's company. It is worth noting that Michael's background was not perfect. In the year of 2015, after stealing money, computer equipment, and a firearm from his workplace, he was arrested for burglary. This was the vet clinic where he worked alongside Casey and Sarah. Casey had forgiven him enough to assist him in this situation. And she even assisted him as she looked after their family as he fled to New Mexico to avoid arrest. Casey took great pride in her children. She started a YouTube channel to share special moments along the way. Many of these videos show Michael having fun with his daughters. And having a good time with his wife and family. Looking through this lens at their daily lives, the family appeared to be perfectly content. Michael appeared to be at ease and content with his life. And, despite the fact that Casey was mostly behind the camera, she was frequently heard giggling and laughing. However, tragically, not long after her last recorded video, one of the worst nightmares imaginable was about to unfold. On July 10, 2019, suspicions began to surface. Casey's friends and family noticed that she abruptly stopped taking calls or making plans with them. When she did message them on Facebook or elsewhere, something appeared to be out of character. The way she typed messages and the mannerisms of these messages were not typical of her. Richard Bowers was one of those who stopped hearing from her, which was Casey's previous husband and Preston and Cameron's father. On July 27, he arrived at the property to take his sons home for a few weeks. There was also no sign of her. And when Richard asked where she was, Michael replied that she was out of town. Richard assumed Casey didn't want to see him because they had previously argued. He returned home with his children, not thinking anything more of it. Casey's mother, Nikki, received a text message from Casey's number on August 1. The message asked if she could keep an eye on Merkley and Ayanna for a few weeks. Nikki agreed to her daughter's request, but never actually saw her. When the children were dropped off at her house, Michael was the only one present at the time. Nikki found this odd because she hadn't seen or spoken to Casey in person in over 3 weeks, or even received a voice call. So, while both sets of kids were away, Michael was not actually alone in the house, and during this time frame, he looked after his first set of children from his former partner, Sarah. However, by August 11th, Sarah's children Cameron and Preston were once again in the care of Michael and, allegedly, Casey. It had been a week since anyone had seen or spoken to Casey in person. Michael was in charge of all day-to-day arrangements. Nobody would hear from or see Preston or Cameron. Around this time, Michael placed an ad on Facebook Marketplace to sell 2 twin mattresses, which were eventually sold to a couple from the Summerfield area. The couple went to the Jones residence on August 17th to pick up these 2 mattresses. However, it was an unusual encounter. For one thing, the mattresses smelled like death, and Michael was acting strangely. Richard also wished his son a happy birthday on August 22nd. However, he never received a response from anyone. And that's when the alarm bells started to ring. It was only a few days later, on August the 28th, Merkley and Ayanna were no longer seen or heard from, and to add to the strange circumstances, a number of other things were going on at the same time. To begin, the Jones family received an eviction notice. They were expected to leave within the next 2 weeks. Then, as many people in and around the Florida area will recall, Hurricane Dorian struck. Dorian was a Category 5 hurricane that was extremely powerful at the time. Was the strongest to hit the northwestern Bahamas. According to records, a state of emergency was declared for the entire state of Florida. Many people sought refuge, either nearby, in public emergency shelters, or by fleeing the approaching disaster. One of those fleeing the area, Michael, who traveled north to stay with his ex-wife and their children, was strangely alone. Despite spending the entire 10 days there, and despite the ongoing disaster in Florida, Sarah never saw Michael call his wife or children. And although this didn't sit well with her, she knew that Michael and Casey were having issues, so she never bothered to ask. It was just after Hurricane Dorian passed and while the Jones family was still away from the property, neighbors reported a foul odor emanating from within the house. The landlord was eventually notified, and since the Jones family was supposed to be out by now, he decided to look inside the house through the windows. The house was still full of furniture and personal belongings, and the stench was absolutely revolting. And could only be described as something dead. There are many questions now about why Casey and her children's family and friends waited so long to notify authorities about their disappearance. And, while there were concerns about Casey's well-being, the family thought that maybe Michael was evading the law again. As a result, the family went into hiding for his safety. However, on September 14, 2019, 66 days after Casey went silent, Nikki had had enough and called the Marion County Sheriff's Office to request a welfare check. It had been 66 days since anyone had spoken to Casey. Cameron and Preston haven't been seen in 34 days. And 17 days since Merkley and Ayanna had gone silent. Officers were understandably concerned when they heard this, and a welfare check was immediately conducted. When deputies arrived at the residence shortly before midnight, they learned from local residents that not only had no one seen the Jones family in over 2 weeks, but that the Jones family had gone missing. However, a foul odor was constantly emanating from the property. The smell was immediately recognized by police officers. It was reminiscent of the decomposing human or animal. And to add to the ever-growing list of concerning clues, the house was now empty and looked recently cleaned and some of the floors looked brand new. The clues left behind were enough to worry the authorities. As a result, every effort was made to reach out to the Jones family. Despite all efforts to locate them, investigators returned with nothing but silence. As a result, a missing persons post was created and shared on Facebook. Casey, Preston, Cameron, Merkley, and Ayanna were all reported missing and in danger. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn. As later that very same day, police officers in Bradley County, Georgia, responded to an alarming scene. Michael Jones had veered off the road 170 miles north of Summerfield and crashed the family vehicle into a concrete sewage tunnel. And although he managed to get out of the car unharmed, the vehicle was a total write-off. As soon as police officers arrived, they detected a foul odor. And upon asking Michael what the smell was, he had a very awful confession to make. Michael confirmed that if they were to look inside, they would tragically find the decaying body of his wife. Furthermore, he was willing to show them where he'd buried his children's bodies. Michael was clearly arrested shortly after this, and after telling authorities where to look for his slain children, Charlton County received the call to search for them. Located in the woods near a highway, a large patch of fresh earth was located, and horrifyingly, under the recently disturbed soil lay the bodies of Cameron, Ayanna, Preston, and Merkley. Hearing the news, Those close to the Jones family were distraught, terrified, and disgusted. Despite the fact that they had already expressed grave concern about their whereabouts, many could not even begin to fathom Michael's gruesome actions. All of this had to be one of the most horrendous outcomes possible. Their deaths severely affected multiple families. Richard Bowers lost both of his sons and his ex-wife to the man she'd left him for. And now Nikki had to face the terrible task of burying her daughter and 4 grandchildren. And one of those most affected was his ex-wife, Sarah. It turns out that the children she and Michael shared stayed in his house multiple times after he murdered his wife, and during that time, they were under the full supervision of a murderer. Michael had even spent several days sheltered with Sarah and the kids during Hurricane Dorian. And, shockingly, all of this occurred after he had murdered his family. Sarah and the kids are extremely lucky to be unharmed. Michael was willing to be interviewed by officers following his arrest. Throughout his interrogation, he remained calm, collected, and concise in his actions. No attempt was made to deceive the officers. Michael even expressed gratitude for being apprehended. According to Michael, the entire incident stemmed from a heated argument in which Casey accused him of cheating on her with another woman. However, Michael denied these claims, causing friction between the two. Casey then allegedly approached him with a baseball bat, and after prodding him with it, Michael lost all sense of self-control. He snatched the bat from her grasp before striking her across the head several times. Michael, tragically, did not stop beating his wife until he was certain she was dead. He then wrapped her body in a plastic bag and placed it in the closet before cleaning up any visible blood. Meanwhile, all 4 children were fast asleep in the house. Michael began to weave a web of lies and deception to cover his tracks after her death. Over the next few weeks, he used Casey's phone to send text and Facebook messages to friends and family in the hopes that they would believe she was still alive. It was on August 10, which was 31 days after he murdered her, that he made the decision to murder Casey's 2 sons. Without going into explicit details and out of respect, Michael strangled Cameron to death. He then waited until the next night to murder Preston, in which he strangled him to death with cable ties. As time passed in Florida's hot and humid climate, the decay of the bodies was accelerated, and the stench spread. On August 23, with his wife and 2 stepsons already dead, Michael was served with an eviction notice, putting him under even more pressure. He couldn't keep the bodies in the house any longer. And if he were even to try and get away with his awful actions, he'd need to change the flooring. Michael took his 2 daughters to the local police station 5 days later, on August 28. He sat with them on a park bench opposite the area, trying to muster the courage to turn himself in. Unfortunately, his determination dissolved into pure cowardice. When he returned home, he drowned both of his daughters in the bathtub that night. Michael traveled to Jacksonville to stay with his ex-wife 2 days later, during the hurricane. And, unbeknownst to her or anyone else at the time, he drove up with 5 bodies in the trunk of his car. They remained in there for 16 days until Michael buried his children. Casey was 33 years old, Cameron was 10, Preston 5, Merkley 3 and Ayanna was only 11 months old. Michael would be tried for Casey's second-degree murder. He would, however, face first-degree murder charges for all 4 children. And since he already confessed to the murders, the least he would get behind bars was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But with this being Florida, the death penalty is still very possible. Post-mortem autopsies and police reports presented in court confirmed some heartbreaking facts. Cameron had suffered a broken mandible or lower jaw during his death. Preston was found with a plastic zip tie around his neck. The remains of Merkley and Ayanna were discovered inside a plastic bag. They had a baby bottle with them, as well as a small pair of gold sandals. Casey's body had been wrapped in a rug and a black and white shower curtain, and the front of her skull had been damaged in the manner of massive blunt force trauma. It was most likely caused by an object rather than an accident. During his trial, the defense argued that for a variety of reasons, jurors should spare Michael's life. This included his so-called abusive relationship with Casey, where Casey appeared to be the abuser, his traumatic childhood, he was on a cocktail of drugs at the time of the murders, and he had a complicated history with his mental health. According to the defense, Michael had a very abusive childhood after being a victim of child molestation by his father and, later, his stepfather. Michael was also said to have a history of banging his head against the walls and the floor. All of this was in an attempt to silence the voices in his head. And although this was Michael's angle, and friends and family were able to confirm some of his difficulties, the defense would also argue that Casey frequently dominated him. And that his recent traumatic experiences and episodes had precipitated a free fall into psychotic chaos. Michael testified that he was subjected to nagging, poking and prodding, and that all of the stress was starting to detrimentally affect him. He also justified their children's murder by claiming that they could now be with their mother. A clinical and forensic psychologist concluded that there is evidence that Michael came from a dysfunctional family, with evidence of sexual, mental and physical abuse along with intense violence. But the prosecution was not forgiving. They stated that all 5 murders were spread over 49 days, highlighting that Michael had plenty of time to calm down and rationalize his emotions. Instead, he proceeded with cold calculation. At each interval of time, Michael engaged in a web of lies as he covered his tracks, using his wife's phone to deceive multiple people, lying to his ex-wife, and even asking her for a fake alibi. Being interviewed while his trial was ongoing, Michael's ex-wife Sarah declared, "I wish they'd already hung him up and been done, because I don't think he deserves to walk another day on earth." In Florida, defendants convicted of first-degree murder can face the death penalty if the jury unanimously recommends it. And in Michael's case, that is exactly what happened on January 13, 2023. This decision is now ultimately up to the judge, who has not yet scheduled a date for the sentencing. However, given the circumstances, he will very likely follow through with this verdict. Michael Jones killed 5 of those closest to him, 4 of whom were innocent children that all depended on him. He murdered them on 4 separate occasions over the course of 49 days. And unlike the murder of his wife, this was not a case of losing self-control in the heat of the moment. Whether or not one believes in the death penalty, Michael's actions clearly place him near the top of the list of criminals deserving of such a punishment. Murdering his wife is a terrible thing that cannot be forgiven. But to murder 4 innocent children is so unspeakably vile that it's almost suffocating to think about. During his trial, Casey's sister said that the death of her sister and children has devastated their family. She eventually had to leave her job because it required her to be exposed to the triggering sight of children's clothing. And following her unemployment, she was unable to leave her bed for more than 6 months. The pain of knowing that her nephews and nieces will never graduate from school, get married or have their own children plagues her mind, and at times it feels almost too much to bear. Nothing can ever be done to fill the voids left behind by Casey and her kids. That's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel to grow. Thank you and goodbye.